more naturally me, right? I'm going to give you an example of why advanced scholars, people who are either in the last 2 years of their undergraduate work, or especially people who are in graduate work, tend to have sometimes a hard time determining, are they right brain, are they left brain, are they whole brain with a right preference, are they whole brain with a left preference, or what Gregork would call, the abstract random, the abstract sequential, the concrete random, the concrete sequential. The reason that you may have a harder time as a graduate student knowing exactly what your style is because to get to that level, you've usually learned how to do all of those fairly well. So even though you started out with a natural talent, either at coming up with new ideas, half-baked ideas, being a dreamer. Dreamers, that's the Farinelli term for what Done and Dunn would call the global or the totally right brain person, or what Gregork would call abstract random. I like to call those dreamers. They love to be in the dream world, the world of ideas. They don't necessarily like getting those things done. But for those people to get to the graduate level, or to do well and get into their upper level classes, they had to learn to do the other steps. So let me give you an example. And this goes for any of those different styles of learners. Go back to freshman composition, whichever class you had to do your first research paper. If you got an A on your research paper, then you generally had to come up with a topic. Now maybe the teacher gave you a list of topics and you had to choose one, or maybe the teacher let your class kind of have a brainstorming session where you just put ideas out there. Now knowing you, I'm talking to the person who's doing this interview, you probably did a paper back there on horses at some point. Am I right?
Probably.
Okay, so if you were given that choice, you might have said, well, I'd like to do it on horses. But if you were to write everything there is to write about horses, you would have to write 20 volumes of about 500 pages each volume, and still might not have even started, right?
Right.
So you'd have to decide, do I just want to write about barrel racing, or do I just want to write about using horses in therapy? You'd have to really narrow it down. So you also had to learn how, even though you were an abstract, a global thinker, you had to learn to narrow that down and then decide, now after I narrow my topic down, what are 3 or 4 or 5 supports that I want to use for my supporting paragraphs? And you had to put that into a sequence, right? You had to do an outline. So even though you may not be a person who likes to outline, you might just like talking about horses in general, you had to finally narrow it down and put it into an outline. So you had to go from totally abstract random, now I'm using Gregork, into the abstract sequential. Or from what Done and Dunn said, you're over here in your right brain, but you also had to learn to get into the whole brain with the right preference kinds of skills to be able to do that paper alone. You didn't have the luxury of getting a team together where somebody enjoyed putting it into a sequence. You had to learn to do that well.
That's true.
Then you had to go to the next step of going and gathering the information, all the research about whichever, barrel racing or whatever, because you had to have some footnotes, remember? You couldn't just put down your own ideas. You had to go find what the experts said. So you had to become a concrete random, a gatherer, one of those pack rats, to go and gather information. So to survive that composition class, you had to learn to do that step well, even though it wasn't your natural learning style. And then you had to write a paper, a rough draft. You had to go through and edit it and do the final rewrite. So you had to do all of the concrete sequential stuff in the end, the finishing of the finished product, and get it in on time. Or you didn't get it in on time, you lost points, or you might have got an F. So even though you are a global, you had to learn to do all of those other steps well, to get as far as you've gotten now as a doctoral student.
That's true.
So one of the things that I find is I say go back to before you learn to do all the steps well and try to remember which of those steps were most natural to you. Like some freshman comp students will cheat and they'll write the whole paper first and then go back and create the outline only because it's required or they get points for it.
Yeah.
Right?
Uh-huh.
I've even known students who could type out a very good finished copy and then they would handwrite a rough draft and make some errors in it to make it look like they had done a rough draft because they were so concrete sequential that that's what they would do.
Yeah.
But if you did it in the order that you were supposed to do it in your composition class, you had to learn to do each of those steps and to do them well. Now, usually, as leaders, we know how to get groups of people together, some of whom are very good at coming up with new ideas, some who are very good at putting things into a sequence, some who are very good at gathering resources, some who are very good at getting the finished product done on time, and putting them together and appreciating all of them as having special gifts. So as a group leader, you know how to get those together. But when you're taking a class where you've got to do the whole thing and have it in on time, you've had to learn to have skills of all those. The one that is your natural learning style, your natural thinking style, and all the others as well.
That's true.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, then we'll call it quits on that little discussion.